Tonight, a focus on America's global challenges. A new way forward in Afghanistan.
The status quo is not sustainable.
Ultimately, we will succeed.
As U.S. troops prepare to withdraw from another conflict.
We are in the middle of major drawdowns in Iraq.
The international community grows impatient with Tehran.
This is the major supporter, promoter, and exporter of terrorism in the world today.
And U.S. officials reach out to the North Koreans.
I think, as I said, that these were positive talks.
A Christmas special with Charles Krauthammer.
Charles, we've talked many times about an American public that is war-weary. You also, as the general mentioned, have a U.S. military that has been through tour and tour and tour. What about this strategy and how it's going to unfold?
Well, when you add on to that the tentative tone of the president when he announced the surge, we heard him say this is a vital national interest, and then immediately he says in 18 months we start leaving, or we start to, he calls it a transfer. If it's a vital national interest, you shouldn't have an exit date, because that means the country, its security ultimately hinges on this, and it's an odd conjunction of two ideas. The president, in the end, gave the generals, Petraeus and McChrystal, the policy they wanted. Slightly fewer number of troops, but he's getting a contingent from the Europeans, so it's almost about 40,000 if you put them together. They're getting it on a slightly delayed timetable. He's speeding it up, but he took 3 months, so they're not going to be really in place all in place until late next year, at which point he's going to be reconsidering the policy in December of 2010. Nonetheless, if McChrystal and Petraeus, who are the world's expert on this, Petraeus having succeeded with the surge in Iraq and McChrystal having run the special ops in Iraq for 4 years, if they think that this can work, meaning you can reverse the momentum of the war, you can create a space in which you can build the Afghan army, I think you have to give them a deference. But I worry about the uncertain trumpet in the president's speech and the policy, because as the general tells us, war depends on will. And that's what the enemy will be looking at.
Charles, I mean, you have a president who, as a candidate, called this a civil war, who said that the surge in Iraq was not going to work, and now he is overseeing the transfer of troops out of Iraq.
And as president speaks about it as if it was an error, which he does over and over again. He would never have done it. It showed the worst side of America, its sort of impulsiveness, unilateralism, etc., and who doesn't seem to value the fruits of the war. Now, it was a very costly war, but I think you have to look at it the way you do Korea. That was 10 times as many dead in the Korean War. We ended up with half a peninsula, essentially with exactly the status quo at the end as when the war started. So if you compare it to that, it's that kind of a grudging, partial success, but it is a success. We have the only functioning democracy in the Arab world. We have a country where we heard the Prime Minister on the clip a little earlier speak about his desire for strategic cooperation with the United States. Iraq is in the heart of the Middle East. It's sitting on the second largest oil reserve in the world, and it is the most important country in that region strategically. And it wants a strategic alliance over time with the United States. What I worry about is Obama doesn't appreciate how important that kind of alliance is, how it would perpetuate our presence in the area, our influence in the area, which is a very important area, and how that is the hard-won victory. It's not, raising a flag in Iwo Jima, but it is a success. And for that, you have to retain the troops in the area. Training, cooperation, we're not going to be obviously active in combat, but a total withdrawal, which appears to be what Obama wants, would be a way of undoing all of the success that we had at extremely high cost in treasure and in blood.
Charles.
Well, we lost a year on Iran. The administration had to reinvent the wheel. It had an outstretched hand, and it's been ignored, spit on, humiliated. One rejection by Iran to all of the gestures after another, all through this year. Here we are at the end of the year. Nothing is done. The clock is ticking. The Iranians are a year closer to achieving nuclear weapons. And as the Secretary of State said in a clip that we saw earlier, this is a regime that is the biggest perpetrator of terrorism in the world, about to go nuclear. And we are proceeding at a leisurely pace. We may get sanctions into next year. They'll be weak. There'll be lots of negotiations and recalcitrance on the part of the Chinese and the Russians. The sanctions will be useless. All of this is a charade. The real scandal here is that there was a chance to do something important in Iran. There's a revolution happening in the streets today. And it would suit our moral purposes in supporting them and strategic, because the only way to stop a nuke is to have a changing regime. And we stood back. I think that is the scandal of the year. That is a policy we will regret. And to have allowed this opportunity to pass and to not stand up and support the dissidents the way that Reagan did in Eastern Europe in the 80s, I think is something we will regret for a long time.
Very quickly, Charles, does Israel attack, do you think?
Absolutely. I think the Prime Minister today is the son of a historian, and he does not want to be the Prime Minister who presided over the acquisition of weapons of genocide by a country that appears to be intent, its leadership anyway, on committing it.
Charles, after that rough reset, let's start with Russia.
Well, I know it's Christmas, and I hate to be repeatedly and relentlessly pessimistic, but this has not been a good year with U.S. relations with Russia. The naivete of the administration and its dealings are represented in that clip. The reset is a way of saying we are not the Bush administration, but it also means that we're living in a new world of cooperation. It's not zero-sum. Rivalries are abandoned. It's absurd. What we did is we canceled an agreement that we had with the Poles and the Czechs on a nuclear defense shield as a way to appease the Russians in the hope, I suppose, of achieving Russian support on sanctions with Iran. We have gotten absolutely nothing as a result. And as a result, East Europeans are wondering whether they really are independent as a result of the end of the Cold War, or whether Russia retains a veto over their strategic decisions. And the answer looks as if it is. Their position in the world really is intermediate and not independent. It's a kind of an abandonment, with, again, nothing in return. And what we're seeing also in the negotiations over nukes, this is something, a continuation of the Strategic Arms Reduction Agreement, something that the Russians are seeking because their nukes are old and decaying and obsolete, gaining an advantage over us, again in a pursuit, I think, on the American side of a treaty which is not necessary, which will only help the Russians, and it makes it look as if we are desperate for any agreement, regardless of whether it achieves our national interest. The Russians understand that, and they are using our weakness to their advantage.
You're a little pessimistic, Charles.
Well, I mean, a noise is not a policy or a
well,
concession.
not yet, but I mean, at some point they either have to sign on or sign off.
Yeah, but all we're hearing are noises, and I'd be surprised if after all the unilateral concessions, the Russians, who don't have a history of unilateral concessions, are going to engage in it. I was less impressed by the dawn of this new realism. What the president stood up and said was, there's evil in the world, and Gandhi would not have done well against Hitler. Well, for most of us, you dispose of those issues in the first week in the freshman dorm in college, after a couple of late-night discussions. And to elevate it as a great philosophical achievement for him to say that is quite astonishing. It's emperor's new clothes. It's obvious. The fact that we were all impressed is to tell you how unrealistic, idealistic, and naive were all the previous speeches, starting with the speech he gave in 2008 in Berlin, in which he said that the wall had come down in Berlin because the world stood as one. Well, that's not why the wall had come down. It came down because America stood fast for 50 years on the ramparts of freedom and didn't flinch, and in the end, the other guy conceded and collapsed. So this kind of globalism, this universalism, this naivete runs through all of his policy. Mara is right on the one issue of Afghanistan where he had to make a decision. He is a commander-in-chief, and he's going into war. Of course you have to admit there's evil in the world, otherwise why are you going to war? But in all the other approaches, all the globalism, the outreach, the outstretched hand, he's acting again and again in a way in which he's being rejected and rebuffed. And at some point, he's going to have to respond to empirical evidence and change. But he hasn't yet. That one speech in also is not a change.